There is a question that every human being alive right now will, at some point, stop being able to avoid. Not because it is pleasant, not because the answer is satisfying, but because the moment itself is coming for every single one of us. Without exception, without negotiation, without the possibility of postponement, beyond a certain point. What happens the moment you die? I do not mean what happens to your possessions. I do not mean what happens to your legacy, your relationships, the people who loved you. I mean what happens to you, the specific physical, biological, electrochemical entity that is reading or listening to these words right now. What actually occurs in the seconds, the minutes, the hours after that threshold is crossed? Now, here is what science does well. It measures. It quantifies. It tracks the chemistry of decomposition, the cessation of electrical activity in the brain, the cascade of cellular failures that follow the stopping of a heart. These things we can describe with extraordinary precision. We have instruments for them. We have data, but there is a boundary, a specific, well-defined, deeply uncomfortable boundary at which the instruments go quiet. And what lies on the other side of that boundary is not something science has explained. I am going to be precise with you today. It is not something science has yet explained, but the distinction between those two statements, between cannot and has not yet, may be the most important distinction in this entire conversation. Because in the gap between what we know and what we do not, some of the strangest, most rigorous, most disturbing science being conducted on this planet right now is quietly accumulating evidence that the story of you does not end where we assumed it did. Let me take you through it. All of it. The biology, the neuroscience, the quantum mechanics, and the place where all three run out of answers at exactly the same moment. We are going to do something that does not happen often enough in popular science. We are going to follow the data wherever it leads, including into the territory where the data runs out. And we are going to be honest about what that silence means. There are 4 stages to this conversation. The first is what science knows with certainty about the biological process of dying, not the sanitized version. The actual sequence of events, measured and documented. The second is the specific boundary at which the measurable stops, and why that boundary is far less clear than most people believe. The third is the data that should not exist but does. Decades of rigorously collected evidence about experiences at the edge of that boundary that mainstream science has not adequately explained. And the fourth is what physics, at its deepest level, implies about the nature of consciousness and whether the universe has a mechanism for ending it. By the time we reach the 4th stage, you will understand why the title of this video is not a provocation. It is a precise and honest statement about the current state of human knowledge. Science cannot explain it, not yet. And the reason it cannot is more interesting than any answer it could currently offer. The human body does not die all at once. This is one of the most important and least understood facts about biological death. The process is sequential, cascading, and from a purely physiological perspective, deeply ordered. It begins in most cases with the heart. When the heart stops beating, it stops delivering oxygenated blood to the brain. The brain, which consumes roughly 20% of the body's total oxygen supply, despite representing only 2% of its mass, begins to register the deficit almost immediately. Within 10 seconds of cardiac arrest, consciousness is lost. The electroencephalogram, the instrument that measures electrical activity in the brain, begins to flatten. But here's the first thing that should disturb your assumptions. The brain does not go silent immediately. In the minutes following cardiac arrest, something unexpected happens. Studies conducted at the University of Michigan, monitoring the brains of rats in the seconds after induced cardiac arrest, recorded a surge of highly organized, high-frequency electrical activity, a burst of neural coherence, more intense than anything measured during normal waking consciousness. The brain, by measurable electrical standards, became more active in the moments after the heart stopped than it had been during life. The researchers called it a death surge, and they did not have a clean explanation for why it happened. Meanwhile, the cascade continues. Without oxygen, neurons begin to fail. Sodium floods into cells, causing them to swell. The carefully maintained electrochemical gradients that allow nerve cells to fire collapse. Over the course of minutes to hours, depending on the circumstances, the machinery of biological life powers down in a sequence that is, from the outside, irreversible. Within 4 to 6 minutes, without oxygen, significant and typically permanent brain damage begins in most individuals. Within 10 minutes, the processes that support complex neural function have largely ceased. This is the clinical definition of brain death, and it is, in the consensus of modern medicine, the definition of death itself. But, and this is a very significant but, that definition was established when we had no way to reverse cardiac arrest, when the stopping of the heart was effectively a permanent stopping. In the last 40 years, the development of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, defibrillation, and targeted temperature management has changed what death means in a practical sense. People are now routinely brought back from conditions that would have been unambiguously fatal a generation ago. And when they come back, a remarkable number of them report something that medicine has spent decades not knowing what to do with. I want to be careful here, because this is the territory where precision matters most and where imprecision does the most damage. The word boundary is doing a lot of work in this section, and I want to be honest about exactly what I mean by it. The boundary I am describing is this: the point at which the instruments we use to measure brain activity, electroencephalography, functional magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, stop recording organized, complex electrical patterns. The point at which, by our best available measures, the neural correlates of conscious experience are no longer present. And yet, verified, documented, reproducible reports of organized conscious experience continue to occur at and beyond this boundary. This is not anecdote. This is not the confused testimony of frightened people reaching for comfort. This is a body of evidence that has accumulated over decades, across multiple countries, across multiple independent research teams, using increasingly rigorous methodology, producing results that are, by the standards of scientific evidence, deeply anomalous. The largest study of its kind was conducted by Dr. Sam Parnia at the University of Southampton and later at NYU Langone Medical Center. The AWARE study, an acronym for Awareness During Resuscitation, monitored more than 2,000 cardiac arrest survivors across 15 hospitals. The explicit goal was scientific, to determine whether reports of awareness during clinical death could be objectively verified. Specifically, researchers placed images on shelves positioned near the ceiling of resuscitation rooms, images visible only from above, invisible from the perspective of someone lying on a table. The hypothesis was straightforward. If patients reported floating above their bodies and could accurately describe these images, that would constitute objective evidence of visual experience during a period of verified cardiac arrest. The results were complicated. One patient, out of the 2,000 studied, provided a verified account of events during his resuscitation that was confirmed accurate by the medical staff present. He described specific conversations, specific details of the room that he could not have observed from his position on the table. His brain, during this period, showed no organized electrical activity. One verified case does not constitute a revolution in physics. Dr. Parnia himself is careful to say so. But it does constitute a data point that the current scientific framework does not have an adequate explanation for. And in science, a single data point that a theory cannot explain is not dismissed. It is investigated. The investigation is ongoing. And it is producing more data that does not fit comfortably into the current model. What comes next is the part of this conversation that mainstream science finds most uncomfortable. We are going to look at the quantum mechanics of consciousness, at the serious, peer-reviewed, mathematically rigorous work being done right now on whether the mind is something the brain produces or something the brain receives. The distinction matters more than you might think. If you want to be here for that, subscribe now. This is exactly the kind of content that takes significant time and care to build. Let's keep going. I want to describe a category of experience that has been documented so consistently across so many cultures, across so many centuries, and now across so many rigorously controlled studies that dismissing it requires a more strenuous act of faith than taking it seriously. Near-death experiences. The term is, in some ways, unfortunate. It carries with it the accumulated baggage of popular culture, of Hollywood depictions, of the less careful end of the spiritual literature. Let me strip all of that away and describe only what the data shows. Approximately 10 to 20% of cardiac arrest survivors report some form of conscious experience during the period of their arrest. The consistency of the core elements across reports from different countries, different religious backgrounds, different ages, and different eras is, from a purely statistical perspective, striking. These elements include a sensation of separation from the body, enhanced rather than diminished clarity of perception, the experience of moving through a dark space toward a region of intense light, encounters with deceased relatives, a panoramic review of one's life presented with unusual emotional clarity, and a sharp boundary beyond which subjects consistently report being told or feeling that they cannot proceed further. Now, I'm not asking you to accept any particular interpretation of these reports. What I'm asking you to notice is the scientific problem they represent. These experiences are reported as more real than ordinary consciousness, more vivid, more coherent, more emotionally resonant, by people whose brains, during the period in question, showed no electrical activity capable of generating a hallucination of ordinary complexity, let alone an experience of this reported intensity. The hallucination hypothesis, the most common scientific dismissal of these reports, requires the brain to produce its most organized, most vivid, most coherent experiential output precisely at the moment it is least capable of organized activity. That is not impossible. But it is, as scientific explanations go, deeply unsatisfying. It requires us to believe that the organ responsible for experience is performing its most extraordinary work while systematically shutting down. There are researchers who take this problem seriously, not as a spiritual question, as a scientific one, and the scientific framework they are beginning to develop reaches into the deepest, strangest, most unsettled territory in modern physics. The question of consciousness is the hardest problem in science, not the hardest problem in neuroscience. The hardest problem in science Full stop. We know a great deal about the brain. We can map its structure with extraordinary resolution. We can correlate specific patterns of neuroactivity with specific types of experience. We can stimulate specific regions and produce specific sensations. We have made enormous progress in understanding the brain as a physical system. What we have made essentially no progress on is explaining why any of it feels like anything. Why the electrochemical signals traveling between neurons produce a subjective first-person experience of being alive. Why there is something it is like to be you, reading these words, and not simply an unconscious information processing system, executing its programming in the dark. The philosopher David Chalmers named this the hard problem of consciousness in 1995. And in the 30 years since, it has resisted every attempt at solution that assumes consciousness is simply what the brain does, that it is, in other words, produced entirely by the physical machinery of neural activity. A small but serious group of physicists and mathematicians have proposed a different framework, not as mysticism, as physics. The most developed version of this idea was proposed by mathematician Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. They call it orchestrated objective reduction, OR for short. And while it remains deeply controversial, it is built on legitimate quantum mechanics. The core proposal is this. Within the neurons of the brain, there are structures called microtubules, cylindrical protein assemblies, that form part of the cellular skeleton. Penrose and Hameroff propose that these microtubules are capable of sustaining quantum coherence, the same phenomenon that allows quantum computers to process information in ways classical computers cannot. And that consciousness itself is not a product of classical neural computation, but of quantum processes occurring inside these structures. If this is correct, and I want to be clear that it remains unproven, contested, and in many quarters actively disputed, the implications for what happens at death are profound. Because if consciousness is a quantum process, then it is subject to the laws of quantum mechanics, including the law that quantum information cannot be destroyed. We have established this in the previous video in this series. The conservation of quantum information is one of the most robustly tested principles in physics, confirmed after decades of controversy, even in the context of black holes. Information encoded in quantum states persists. It is scrambled, it is redistributed, but it is not erased. If consciousness is quantum information, if what makes you is a pattern of quantum states, rather than simply a pattern of classical neural connections, then the moment of death does not delete you. It disperses you in a way that may be, for any practical purpose, irreversible, but not in a way that constitutes annihilation. And here's why science cannot currently explain what happens at the moment of death, because to explain, it would require a complete theory of consciousness, where it comes from, what physical substrate it runs on, what happens to that substrate when the brain stops functioning. We do not have that theory. We have pieces. We have hints. We have data from near-death research that does not fit our current models and theoretical frameworks from quantum mechanics that might eventually explain why. But the complete picture is not yet assembled. The honest answer to the question, what happens the moment you die, is, we know what happens to the body with extraordinary precision. We know what happens to the brain in measurable terms. And at the boundary of the measurable, we have data we cannot explain and theories we cannot yet confirm. Science has not explained it yet. I want to say something about ignorance, because science has a complicated relationship with the word. In casual usage, ignorance is a flaw, an absence, something to be ashamed of and corrected. But in science, the precise mapping of what we do not know is one of the most valuable things we can produce, because it tells us where to look. It defines the frontier. And the frontier is where everything interesting happens. We do not know what consciousness is. This is not a minor gap. It is the central mystery of human existence, approached from the direction of physics rather than philosophy. And the fact that science cannot explain what happens at the moment of death is not a failure. It is a precise description of where the frontier currently sits. That frontier has moved continuously. Every decade of the 20th century produced revisions to what we thought was settled about the nature of matter, energy, time, and space. The quantum mechanics that might eventually explain consciousness would have been considered mystical nonsense by the physicists of 1850. The biology of neural complexity would have been incomprehensible to the scientists of 1750. We should be very cautious about assuming that the framework we currently hold is the final framework. Carl Sagan, whose shadow I have spent my career working in, and whose intellectual honesty I have tried to honor, wrote that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is a principle that applies with particular force to the question of what consciousness is and what happens to it. We do not have the evidence yet. That means we do not know. It does not mean the answer is the one that requires the least imagination. The universe has, in my experience of studying it, consistently turned out to be stranger than we assumed. Not stranger in ways that validate any particular tradition or any particular hope. Stranger in ways that were not anticipated by anyone, that required entirely new mathematical structures to describe, and that left everyone who first encountered them deeply unsettled. There is no reason to believe the question of consciousness will be an exception to that pattern. So, what really happens to you the moment you die? Here's what the biology tells us. Your heart stops. Your brain loses its oxygen supply. Within seconds, consciousness, as measured by our instruments, ceases. Within minutes, the cellular machinery begins its irreversible shutdown. The biological entity that was you proceeds through a sequence of changes that returns its component matter to the broader cycles of the living world. Here's what the physics tells us. The energy that animated you is conserved, without exception, by the first law of thermodynamics. The matter that constituted you is indestructible and will cycle through other forms for as long as the universe exists. The information encoded in the quantum states of your physical being is, according to the conservation laws that govern quantum mechanics, permanent. Here is what the anomalous data tells us. A meaningful percentage of people who have crossed the clinical boundary of death and returned report organized, vivid, coherent conscious experience during the period when their brains showed no activity capable of generating it. We have one objectively verified case. We have thousands of subjectively reported ones. We do not have an explanation that satisfies the standards of the science we are trying to apply. And here's what the honest answer looks like. Assembled from all three. We know what the body does. We know what the physical laws require. And at the precise boundary, where the subjective experience of being you intersects with those physical laws, at that exact point, science goes quiet. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because we have not yet built the instruments, developed the theory, or assembled the complete framework to answer it. The question is real. The evidence is real. The gap in our understanding is real. And in my experience, the gaps in our understanding are the most interesting places in the universe. The atoms in your body have been part of this cosmos for 13.8 billion years. They have been inside stars, inside nebulae, inside ancient organisms whose names we will never know. They arrived at you through a sequence of events so improbable that the only honest response is a kind of stunned gratitude. And when this particular arrangement dissolves, those atoms will continue their journey through forms and futures we cannot imagine. Whether the specific pattern of information that makes you persists in some physically meaningful sense, whether the first-person experience of being you is something the universe keeps a record of,